What happens when two officers decide a quiet old man in a worn-out coat doesn't belong in a diner, and then find out exactly who they just made the mistake of humiliating. This story started on a Tuesday morning in November. The kind of cold that settles into your bones before you even step outside. The kind of gray sky that makes the whole world look like it has already given up. But Chester Ray Holloway hadn't given up. Not after Korea. Not after Vietnam. Not after the stroke that took his wife and the landlord who took his apartment. Not after any of it. Chester was 70 years old. He walked with a slight lean to the left, the result of shrapnel that had never been fully removed from his right hip. He wore a forest green jacket, faded at the elbows, with a small American flag pin on the lapel that had been there so long the gold had worn down to silver. His boots were scuffed but clean. Chester was always clean. That was one thing he kept no matter what. Even when he was sleeping in the Millbrook Community Shelter on Garfield Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee, he made sure his hands were washed and his collar was straight. He said his mother taught him that. He said dignity wasn't something circumstances could take from you unless you let them. He had been going to Eddie's Diner on the corner of Front Street in Madison every Tuesday morning for 3 months. Not because he had money to burn. He had almost none. But because the owner, a wide-shouldered Greek man named Stavros Papadakis, had made him a quiet deal. Chester helped sweep the back lot behind the kitchen on Monday evenings, and in return Stavros let him sit in the corner booth on Tuesday mornings and have coffee and toast. No fuss, no sign above the door, just two men who had made an arrangement and kept it. Chester liked that booth. It faced the window, so he could watch the street wake up. He liked the smell of the eggs and the sound of the bell above the door. He liked that Stavros always gave him the mug with the thick handle because Chester's hands shook slightly in the cold. Small things, quiet things, the kind that hold a life together when the bigger things have all fallen away. That Tuesday he was already settled in his corner, both hands wrapped around the mug, watching a pigeon hop along the curb outside. When the squad car pulled up, 2 officers stepped out. Officer Dale Pruitt was the first through the door. He was 34, medium height, with a jaw that looked like it was always set for an argument. His partner, Officer Kyle Bremer, was younger, maybe 28, blonde, the kind of fresh face that hadn't yet decided what kind of cop he wanted to be. They came in with the cold, and they stood just inside the door, scanning the room the way officers do when they're not looking for trouble, so much as deciding where to make some. Pruitt's eyes landed on Chester almost immediately. He walked over slowly, not like a man who needed something, but like a man who had already made a decision. "Sir," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either, more like a word with a wall behind it. "You need to show me some ID." Chester looked up from his mug. His eyes were dark brown, steady, the kind of eyes that had seen enough not to be rattled by much. "Good morning, officer," he said. "May I ask what the problem is?" Pruitt didn't answer the question directly. "We got a call," he said. Someone reported a suspicious individual loitering in the area. Chester looked at him evenly. "I'm not loitering. I'm a customer." Pruitt's gaze flicked to the almost empty coffee mug, the single plate of toast, the worn jacket. "Can you prove that?" And there it was. Not a question, really. A challenge, wrapped in the costume of procedure. Chester reached slowly into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not an ID, because his state ID had expired 2 years ago, and replacing it required a permanent address he didn't have. The paper was a letter, slightly creased but legible, from a Millbrook Community Shelter confirming his residency. He placed it on the table. Pruitt glanced at it, then back at Chester. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not regret. Satisfaction. "Sir, I need you to come outside with me." From behind the counter, Stavros looked up. His expression changed. "Gentlemen," he said, voice careful. "This man is my customer. He has my permission to be here. There is no problem." Pruitt didn't look at Stavros. He kept his eyes on Chester. "Sir, outside, please." Chester set his mug down. His jaw was tight, but his hands were still. He had been in situations where the wrong move cost everything. He knew how to be still. He slid out of the booth slowly and followed Pruitt toward the door. Bremer held it open, and as Chester passed, Bremer looked at him. Something passed over the younger officer's face, something that wasn't quite comfortable with what was happening. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. Outside on the sidewalk, the cold hit hard. Pruitt stood facing Chester with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Look," he said, his voice dropping, losing the professional sheen now that no one could hear them. "I'm going to be straight with you. We don't need people like you hanging around this part of town, scaring off business. This is a nice street. Family street. You understand what I'm saying?" Chester looked at him for a long moment. "People like me," he said quietly. Pruitt didn't flinch. "You know what I mean?" Chester did know. He had been knowing that phrase his entire life, worn smooth in different mouths, but always carrying the same weight. He had heard it at lunch counters in Alabama in 1968. He had heard it outside a recruiting office where they almost turned him away before another officer overruled the decision. He had heard it whispered behind hands at places that called themselves welcoming. He knew exactly what it meant. "You want me to leave?" Chester said. "I want you to understand how things work," Pruitt said. Chester reached into his jacket pocket again. Slowly, deliberately, Pruitt's hand moved toward his belt. Chester noticed. He moved even more slowly. He pulled out a small cell phone. It was an old model, cracked at one corner, the kind you could get prepaid at a gas station. Stavros had given it to him 2 months ago after Chester mentioned he had no way to be reached. "I need to make a call," Chester said. Pruitt's eyes narrowed. "We're not done here. You haven't charged me with anything," Chester said, his voice as calm as still water. "I'm going to make a phone call." Pruitt opened his mouth, closed it. He technically had nothing. No crime, no complaint that would hold up. Just a homeless man standing on a sidewalk in the cold, making him feel challenged. And that, it turned out, was enough to make him dangerous. "Don't make this complicated, old man," Pruitt said. Chester looked at him. Then he dialed. And right there, in the gray November cold, outside a diner on Front Street in Memphis, Tennessee, with a pigeon watching from the curb and a young officer who hadn't yet decided what kind of cop he wanted to be standing 3 feet away, Chester Ray Holloway made the phone call that would end 2 careers. But neither officer knew that yet. They just stood there, waiting, watching an old man in a worn green coat hold a cracked cell phone to his ear. And that was their mistake. The phone rang twice on the other end. Chester spoke when it picked up. His voice was low, private, unhurried. He gave a name, said a few sentences. Then he said, "Yes, sir, that would be appreciated." He hung up. Pruitt looked at him with something between amusement and irritation. "Who was that?" Chester slid the phone back into his pocket. "Someone who knows how things work," he said. Pruitt almost smiled. "Sure," he said. He gestured toward the street. "I think it's time you moved along." Chester looked at him steadily. "I think I'll wait right here," he said. Bremer, who had been quiet this whole time, shifted slightly. His eyes moved from Chester to Pruitt and back again. There was something he was seeing that Pruitt wasn't. Or maybe something he was finally allowing himself to see. Pruitt stepped closer, close enough that it was meant to feel like pressure. "I'm going to ask you one more time." "Officer." The voice came from behind them, firm and clear and carrying the kind of weight that came not from volume, but from absolute certainty. Pruitt turned. A man stood on the sidewalk 10 feet away. He was maybe 62, lean, wearing civilian clothes, but standing the way military people stand, like the ground itself was accountable to them. He was black. His hair was salt and pepper and close-cropped. In his right hand, he held a badge wallet, flipped open. "Deputy Inspector Gerald Holloway," he said. "Office of Professional Responsibility, Memphis Police Department." The air changed. Pruitt's jaw tightened. Bremer went very still. "I got a call," Gerald Holloway said, walking toward them at an even pace. "From my father." And he looked at Chester, and Chester looked at him. And between them was something that had nothing to do with titles or badges. It was just a son who had come when his father called, the way sons are supposed to. Pruitt's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Recognition, recalculation, something close to the beginning of panic. "I didn't," he started. "Don't," Gerald said quietly. He looked at Pruitt like a man who had read the report before he arrived, because he had already called in and pulled the body camera request from dispatch. "I'm going to need your badge numbers. Both of you." Chester stood between them, hands in his pockets, waiting. He wasn't looking at Pruitt anymore. He was watching the pigeon on the curb. It had found something to eat. Inside the diner, Stavros was pressed close to the window, watching. Gerald Holloway didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. He had been with the Office of Professional Responsibility for 11 years after 17 years on patrol. He had seen every version of this story, but this one was personal in a way that made his chest feel tight and his jaw ache from holding himself steady. Because here was his father, a man who had earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a Combat Infantryman badge across 2 wars. A man who had come home from Vietnam to a country that spat on him at the airport and told him to take off the uniform if he didn't want trouble. A man who had worked 30 years as a machinist, raised 3 children, buried a wife, and then through a cascade of medical bills and misfortune that no single person could have predicted or prevented, lost everything except his dignity and his flag pin. And 2 officers who could not see past a worn jacket had decided to use that against him. Gerald took both badge numbers. He was professional about it. Precise. He told them they were not to approach his father again, that the interaction had been recorded by the diner's exterior camera and by the department dispatch body cam request he had already initiated, and that they should return to their unit and expect contact from his office before end of shift. Pruitt tried once more. With all due respect, sir, we were responding to a call. Who made the call? Gerald said. Pruitt paused. A concerned citizen. I'm going to need that information, Gerald said. Because if that call was made on the basis of race and not on the basis of any actual observed criminal behavior, that is a separate matter I'll be looking at in addition to your conduct today. Silence. Bremer looked at his shoes. Then he looked up. Sir, he said, and his voice was different from Pruitt's. Smaller, more honest. I want to say, for the record, that I wasn't comfortable with how this was handled. Pruitt turned to him sharply. Gerald looked at Bremer for a moment. Nodded once. That's noted, he said. You want to put that in writing. The squad car pulled away 10 minutes later. Pruitt was driving. He didn't look back. Chester and Gerald stood on the sidewalk alone for a moment. The cold was still there. The pigeon had moved on down the block. You didn't have to come yourself, Chester said. Yeah, I did, Gerald said. Chester nodded slowly. He looked down at his boots. Your mother always said you were stubborn. Gerald almost smiled. She said a lot of things. A beat of quiet between them. The kind that only existed between people who had been through enough together that silence wasn't empty. Coffee's getting cold, Chester said. Then let's go in, Gerald said. They went back inside. Stavros met them at the door without a word and led them to the corner booth, and he brought 2 thick-handled mugs and did not ask any questions. He set down a plate of toast and a plate of eggs and walked back to the counter and pretended to be very busy with something near the register. Chester wrapped his hands around the mug. Gerald sat across from him and looked at his father the way you look at something you almost lost. I'm going to fix this, Gerald said. Not about the officers. About something bigger. About the address. The ID. The gap between the man his father was and the way the world had been treating him. Chester looked out the window. A couple walked past on the sidewalk, bundled against the cold, heads down. You can't fix everything, Chester said. No, Gerald agreed. But some things. What neither of them said out loud, but both of them knew, was that the real damage from that morning had already started moving through channels that Pruitt and Bremer had no idea about. Gerald had made 2 calls before he arrived at the diner. One to dispatch for the body cam data. One to his direct supervisor, Assistant Commissioner Diane Forsyth, who had a long memory and a short tolerance for exactly this kind of pattern. Because it turned out this wasn't the first call from this area. It wasn't the first complaint from this block. Pruitt had a history. Not the kind that got him fired. The kind that got quietly buried. A complaint from a man in Midtown who said Pruitt had called him something that doesn't belong in a police report. A use of force notation from a stop 2 years ago that had been categorized as within guidelines by a supervisor who was no longer with the department. Small things. Quiet things. The kind that hold a pattern together when you finally put them in the same room. Gerald had put them in the same room. That afternoon, the Office of Professional Responsibility opened a formal review. Not because of one old man in a diner, but because of what that one old man in a diner turned out to be attached to. Testimony, records, camera footage from 3 separate incidents. A paper trail that had been waiting for someone to follow it to the end. Pruitt's attorney called it a witch hunt. She said the investigation was politically motivated. She said her client had done nothing wrong, that he had responded to a citizen complaint and conducted himself professionally. The body cam footage from the diner exterior disagreed. Gerald had been right about one thing. The camera on the building across the street, belonging to a dry cleaner who had installed it after a break-in, had caught the sidewalk interaction in full. There was no audio, but there was Pruitt stepping into Chester's space with his hand near his belt, and Chester not moving, not raising his hands, not doing anything that could have been read as threatening by anyone watching with clear eyes. The formal review board convened 3 weeks later. It was not a media event. Gerald had been careful about that. He did not want his father's name in the papers. Chester had told him clearly, "I didn't do this to be a story. I did it because it was wrong and because I could." At the hearing, Chester was asked to appear and give a statement. He came in his green jacket, the flag pin cleaned and gleaming. He sat in front of the board with the same stillness he had shown on the sidewalk. They asked him to describe what happened. He described it, cleanly, precisely, no embellishment. He did not say he was afraid, though perhaps he had been. He did not say he was angry, though he had every right to be. He said he had been a customer in a diner where he had permission to be. He said he had been asked to leave based on what he looked like and where he slept. He said he had made a phone call because that was the appropriate response to what had happened. And then he said something that made the hearing room go very quiet. "I spent 50 years serving this country," he said. "I serve in conditions that most people can't imagine. I came home twice, and I put away my uniform, and I went to work, and I paid my taxes, and I raised my children. And then life did what life does, and I found myself with less than I had before. But I have never stopped being a citizen. I have never stopped being a veteran. And I have never stopped being a man who deserves to be treated with dignity." Those officers did not see any of that. They saw a code and made a decision. And that decision was wrong. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the board chair, a woman named Commissioner Patricia Henley, looked at Chester over the top of her reading glasses and said, "Mr. Holloway, on behalf of this department, I want to apologize." Chester nodded once. He didn't say it was all right, because it wasn't all right. He just nodded, and that was enough. The outcome came down 2 weeks after the hearing. Pruitt was terminated, not suspended, not reassigned, terminated. The board cited a pattern of racially motivated conduct, misuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The prior complaints that had been buried were exhumed and included in the final report. Every one of them mattered now. Bremer received a formal reprimand and was assigned to a mandatory training program in constitutional policing. He had cooperated fully with the investigation. He had submitted his written statement the same afternoon Gerald asked for it. Gerald had noted that too. Pruitt's attorney released a statement calling the decision an injustice. Pruitt himself stood on the steps of his attorney's office and told the 3 reporters who showed up that he had been treated unfairly. Nobody in the department contradicted the board's findings. Inside the Millbrook Community Shelter on Garfield Avenue, Chester sat in the common room that evening reading the brief notification Gerald had sent him by text. Terminated. Effective immediately. Chester read it twice. Then he set the phone on the table beside him and looked out the window at the parking lot. A man named Roosevelt, who slept in the bunk above Chester, looked over from the television. "Everything okay, Chess?" Chester looked at the phone, then back at Roosevelt. "Yes," he said. "I think things are going the right direction." Roosevelt nodded slowly. He didn't ask more than that. In a shelter, you learn to let people have their quiet moments. But the story didn't end with a termination notice on a phone screen in a shelter common room, because Gerald Holloway was stubborn in the way his mother had always described, and he was not finished. He had started making calls the day after the diner. Not calls about the case. Calls about his father. He had reached out to the Tennessee Department of Veterans Affairs, to a Veterans Housing Assistance Program he had heard about through a colleague, to a social worker named Angela Reeves who specialized in connecting homeless veterans with benefits they were owed but had never claimed. Chester had a service record that qualified him for benefits he had simply never known to apply for, or had been too proud to pursue, or had not had the address and documentation required to navigate the process. Angela Reeves turned out to be the kind of person who took a problem and didn't let go of it until it was solved. She was in her late 40s, compact, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a voice that said she had heard every excuse the system had to offer and was not interested in adding one more. She met Chester at the shelter on a Thursday morning. They sat in a small conference room near the intake desk. She pulled out a folder. She asked him questions. He answered them. She wrote things down with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and still cared about this one. "You have benefits you never claimed," she said at the end. Chester looked at her. "I didn't know. A lot of veterans don't," she said. "That's why I'm here." Within 6 weeks, Chester had a housing voucher through the VA. Within 8 weeks, he had an apartment, a small place on the second floor of a building on Vance Avenue with a window that faced east and a radiator that knocked when it came on at night. It wasn't much. Chester said it was more than enough. On the morning he moved in, Gerald drove him there in his own car. They carried in 2 bags and a box. Gerald put together a second-hand bed frame, while Chester made coffee on the small gas stove. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Before Gerald left, Chester stopped him at the door. "You know what your mother would say?" Chester said. Gerald raised an eyebrow. "What?" Chester smiled. It was slow and full, the kind of smile that had been waiting a long time for the right moment. She'd say, "Don't you let that boy take all the credit. You called him Chester. You did the hard part." Gerald stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "She would have said that." "Yes, she would have," Chester said. Gerald left. Chester turned back to the apartment. The morning light was coming through the east window now, laying itself across the floor in a long, pale stripe. The radiator knocked twice and went quiet. Outside, a car passed, and someone's music faded down the block. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. The sound of a life that belongs to you. Chester set his mug on the windowsill and stood looking out at the street below. He could see a diner 2 blocks down. Not Eddie's. A different one. But the thought made him think of Stavros, who had called him the week after everything happened and told him the corner booth would always be his on Tuesday mornings. Chester had thanked him. He meant it. He reached up and touched the flag pin on his lapel. The worn silver of it. He had not done any of this to make a point. He had done it because it was wrong and because he had the means to address it, a phone number in a cracked old cell, a son who picked up when his father called, and 70 years of knowing that dignity was not something you surrendered without a fight. 2 officers had looked at an old man in a worn coat and decided he was less than. They had decided the diner was not for him. They had decided the sidewalk was not for him. They had decided they could simply make him disappear back into the invisible spaces where people like him were supposed to stay. They were wrong. And now one of them was carrying his badge to a property window to turn it in, and the other was sitting in a training room learning what the Constitution actually required of the power he carried. And Chester Ray Holloway was standing in his own apartment watching the morning light move across his floor. That is what accountability looks like. Not always loud. Not always on the front page. Sometimes it looks like a cracked cell phone and a steady voice and a son who comes when you call. 2 months after he moved into the apartment on Vance Avenue, Chester was asked to speak at a veterans advocacy event downtown. He almost said no. Then he said yes. He stood at a podium in a conference room in front of about 60 people, veterans, social workers, a few city council members, 2 journalists in the back who had heard there was a story worth telling. He wore his green jacket, the flag pin, his boots still scuffed, still clean. He looked out at the room and said, "I'm not here to tell you about everything I lost. I'm here to tell you that when someone tried to take the last thing I had left, I did not let them. And if you're in a room like this and you're a veteran or you love one, I want you to know that dignity is not optional. It is not a luxury. It is not something you earn back after you have proved yourself again. You already proved yourself. You proved it a long time ago. And anyone who tells you otherwise with a badge or without one has forgotten what the badge is supposed to stand for." The room was quiet the way rooms get quiet when something true has been said. Chester stepped back from the podium and nodded once. Then he walked to his seat in the front row. Gerald was sitting 1 seat over. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on his father's shoulder for a moment and then took it away. And that was enough. Some things don't need a bigger moment than that. A hand on a shoulder. A mug with a thick handle. A window that faces east. A phone call made in the cold to the right person at the right time. That is how power meets accountability. Not always in a courtroom. Sometimes in a diner. Sometimes on a sidewalk in November. Sometimes in the quiet between a father and a son who both know what was almost lost and what, against everything, was saved. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you had every right to be, this story is for you. Speak up. Document it. Make the call. Because silence protects the wrong people and courage protects the rest of us. And if you know a veteran who is struggling, who has served and come home to less than they deserved, don't look the other way. Look directly at them. Ask the question. Make the call. Because they already did the hard part a long time ago, and they shouldn't have to do it alone.